Hi, my name's Don the Pleb. Peter and I are going to be off the air for about a week, and so I'm going to be producing a bunch of these little videos in hopes to keep content going while I'm away. In the prior video, we talked briefly about the Fabian Socialists as a whole, but in specific, I mentioned that they liked social programs, things that people would not call socialism, at least in the modern day. Things like the public school, the National Health Service, the welfare state, etc. You can find regular arguments anywhere on the internet about how these things are not socialism and people on the right need to stop calling them socialism. And as much of a rhetorical trick as that may or may not be, and probably unintentionally, I'm not intending to besmirch any of the people who say this, they probably don't know any better. The Fabians knew that it was. The Fabians knew that this was the method to get the proletariat to accept socialism. Because in the early days of socialism, while the radical revolutionaries ran around trying to get everyone to start the revolution so that they could get their communist utopia, they continuously found that the proletariat simply wasn't interested in destroying their own lives or doing any of the things that socialists thought was popular. The Fabians, on the other hand, knew that if you could get the proletariat to accept things like public education, the National Health Service, the welfare state, that you could show the proletariat in sort of a rote, you lived through it kind of way that collective ownership of these things was indeed the best method. And to the Fabians' credit, the National Health Service is a religion in the UK by this point, so they do seem to be correct. Now, whether or not it's beneficial they're correct, that's clearly I don't think so. But in specific, they were particular fans of public education. And their reasoning for this was that the proletariat were effectively too stupid to understand that their lives were terrible. And so they needed someone to educate them. They would teach these poor fools that their life was actually terrible and that they didn't actually like it and that they were being held down by the bourgeoisie and that the bourgeoisie were doing all of the terrible things that Marx suggested that they were. Again, if we roll forward to modern day, you can clearly see this playing out in any college in the Western world. Every single one of these people thinks that they are being held down by the billionaires, and so they are very interested in things like socialism as a premise. The Fabians were indeed correct. Given enough time, you can teach the proletariat that their lives are terrible, even if people are living the best lives that they have ever lived in all of human history. There is simply no comparison to the poorest among the first world today, and even some of the richest of the time that the Fabians were arguing for this. No less, you see children of parents that are millionaires complaining about how they're being held down, or these ridiculous people talking about class oppression when they are clearly the upper class. It is a perfectly functional system. They were correct. And what's worse is that they were correct in thinking that as soon as you gave public education to the proletariat would A, not think it was socialism, B, would clamor for more of it, and C, if you could get someone who was not a socialist to sell it to them, they would never blame socialism, and the people who recommended it would never claim that it was socialism. They outlined this plan specifically in their own writings. There is the Fabian essays that are the beginning, the aforementioned manifesto for the British. They outline this tactic specifically. However, they subsequently talk about things like a National Health Service because that will inform the public that the government is indeed good, in fact, better than any private healthcare system. This will give the public one more circumstance in which public ownership of the means of production is a great thing, and teach them one step further how it is that they would be able to, as socialists, do better than all of those private, horrible, billionaire, terrible people. To be fair, they weren't talking about billionaires. It was 1889. No less, they outlined the welfare state as how charity clearly is terrible, and so the welfare state will demonstrate to the people that the collective means of production for charity and taking care of the poor is clearly the best method. All of these things they outline as entryism into socialism, and they did it, as I record this, nearly 130 years ago. They knew for a fact that as long as they could make this the general zeitgeist of discussion, as long as this was the publicly acceptable point, that socialism would be an inevitability. And while it may never result in the revolution, it may never result in the workers rising up and seizing the means of production, that they could slow walk you to socialism. And that after a certain point, you would be begging for it. And this is exactly what we see today, everywhere. In the United States, you see Bernie Sanders calling for nationalized health service. You see him calling for the Green New Deal, which is a nationalization of half the country's energy market. You see that, which I should pause there, the idea that utilities should be nationalized was an idea of the Fabians. They saw it as very early works of how socialism could be handed over to the public in a way that they found publicly acceptable. They thought that because the public in the UK had seen the nationalization of some of these utilities, that they could use the idea that basically anything they wanted was a utility, and therefore reference the earlier nationalization of utilities, and that people would find that an acceptable argument. I can't even begin to cover the number of topics that relates to. The Internet Bill of Rights, the net neutrality arguments, they're all the Internet's a utility. We need to seize the means of production, or at least control them in such a way that even if the government doesn't collectively own them, the government makes all the decisions as though the government owns them. Subsequently, this is why you see rate limitations through your local municipalities and their power companies, their water companies, these sorts of things, because it's just price fixing, which the socialists were notoriously fond of. And these small and subtle ways in which they creep into your life, in which they become just around the edges and just a hint here and there. And clearly, this hasn't been a problem. The world hasn't collapsed. This public ownership of this good, well, you see, it was simply a utility and necessary. And so this could be expanded to other things, in fact, everything, over the course of time. And the Fabians, writing as they were 130 years ago, didn't think, or weren't planning, I guess I should say, for every specific minutia of life. Their idea was that as long as we could get some basics, as long as, for example, give me your children and I will give you the man, as I believe Stalin is, I am paraphrasing there, as long as they could accomplish this, then in the long run, socialism would win. They were willing to see this happen over the course of hundreds of years, as opposed to the revolution that the other socialists of the time wanted. They had a much lower time preference, ironic for socialists. No less, they spent their time dreaming up ideas of how they could get you, the average proletariat, to understand that these were good ideas. And they came to a thing that I have been saying for a long time on this channel, and is ever so slowly starting to pick up some traction elsewhere on the internet. The idea that Breitbart was wrong, that culture is not downstream from politics, right? Or politics is not downstream from culture, but rather that culture is downstream from politics. And they knew this, whether or not they would have phrased it that way, because clearly that was their method of doing things. And they called this particular system permeation. And we'll talk about that in the next video.